continue today to look at the law that Moses gives to the Israelites that was passed on to him from God, a law that is very culturally and contextually grounded, one that may seem a little odd to us. Some of the provisions in this law may seem very either antiquated or just very far away culturally from us. And that's okay to sit with a little bit of that dissonance as you read these laws. Remember, as we talked about last week, that the core foundation of God's law is found in the Ten Commandments. And those laws will have cultural and contextual implications throughout the centuries in different localities, depending on how your culture lives or expresses itself. Then you may not have to worry about your ox goring someone else's ox, but you may have to worry about other implications that technologically were not even possible for the people of Israel, or just a different setting in which you live. But as long as we remember that the Ten Commandments are the foundation, that's the core, that's everything that matters, then we will be able to apply those contextual laws to our situation. The key to understanding some of these perplexing laws is found actually in chapter 23 at the very end. God is telling Moses to be very careful on how he associates and how the Israelites associate with the Canaanites who live in the promised land right now. That once they enter into the promised land, it's going to be a slow process. It's not going to be an immediate conquest. And God wants the Israelites to be very careful with how they associate and interact with these foreign people with foreign gods. And so at the end of chapter 23, we read this: "You shall make no covenant with them," the Canaanites, "and their gods. They shall not live in your land, or they will make you sin against me. For if you worship their gods, it will surely be a snare to you." And this really becomes the story of Israel in the Old Testament. How those foreign gods that they relate to because of the foreign people that they associate with and that they make covenants with and that they make treaties with, how those foreign gods lead them into idol worship and lead them away from the true worship of God. And so we can see through the archaeological record, for instance, there are some very practical reasons why God gives some of the laws that seem a little far out there for us. For instance, we as South Georgians love our barbecue and our pork, and so we struggle a little bit with the idea of the Israelites not being able to eat pork. But the archaeological record has shown us that over and over again in Canaanite cities that are excavated, there are plenty of pig bones to be found in these excavated sites. The Canaanites were pig farmers. And so God knew that if the Israelites were to keep themselves from pork, then that would help keep them away from the Canaanites, which would help keep them away from the foreign gods. Also, some of the prohibitions against things like shellfish. We know that the Philistines were one of the biggest enemies, one of the biggest foreign polytheistic enemies to the Israelites. And they lived along the seashore in what we think of now as the Holy Land. And they would have lived in these low-lying areas, maybe even marshy areas. Think of Savannah and the low country on the east coast of Georgia, where we do a lot of shrimping and where we get a lot of these shellfish that are prohibited for the Israelites. God wanted to keep them away from those people as well. And so we know the power of a good low country boil or a good barbecue and how that can lead to social gatherings together. God didn't have anything necessarily against pork or against shellfish. God was trying to keep the people of Israel away from a Canaanite society that could have drawn them in to idol worship and the false worship of the gods of these cultures. God's main purpose after keeping the people away from these polytheistic societies was to ensure that justice would be a hallmark of the Israelite community. God's concern is that all people have an equal access to justice and no one is oppressed or taken advantage of. And that's why the law gives safeguards for things like livestock, because livestock was necessary for, especially for this wandering people during the wilderness years, but into the years of settlement in the Holy Land. Livestock was necessary for their well-being, for their living. This is how they fed their families. This is how they made money. And so God was very concerned that no one be left without an opportunity to provide for their family and provide for others in the community. So some of these laws that seem so odd to us are simply an echo of God's concern for justice in all aspects of the societal life, and that no one would be left without the ability to thrive and the ability to flourish in this community. In fact, God cares very much for those who would normally have a low station in society, or those who would not be able to fend for themselves, or those people who might be naturally oppressed because of the way, unfortunately, we human beings act sometimes. There are several places within the law in which God gives specific concern for orphans and widows and the resident aliens, those who are not necessarily Jewish, but who find themselves living within the Jewish community. In fact, we read in chapter 23 that God says this to the Israelites: "You shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." God is calling back to them to remember their own struggles so that they can be compassionate and help those who are struggling in their society. And we need to remember this today, that those who are the most vulnerable in society need the greatest legal protection. They need the greatest protection by the community of faith. And the community of faith should be active in their compassion and their response to people who are suffering in these ways. God also, in this giving of the law to Moses, extends this understanding of the festivals or the feasts that the people of Israel will celebrate. We've already had some pretty detailed description of what the Passover feast should be like. But here in chapter 23, God sets the stage for there being three main feasts in the life of the Israelites. He talks about them in terms of the harvest here, that they're to have one as the first fruits celebration, and then one towards the regular harvest time when all of the other crops are being harvested. Basically, this is a reminder to the people that you're to celebrate when God provides for you. Again, this is an agricultural and a herding community, and so this is the backbone of their economy, the backbone of their culture. And so God wants them to celebrate the high moments by recognizing His presence with them. As we go on in the book of Exodus, we'll get a little bit more detail to these festivals. But we continue in the Christian tradition to have three main festivals in the life of the church, and two of them correspond with these festivals of the early Israelites and the early Jewish nation. Our Easter celebration corresponds with the Passover festival, and then our celebration of Pentecost corresponds with the first fruits celebration, which would be celebrated by the Israelites. Of course, our other main festival and feast is Christmas, and that does not necessarily correspond to the third feast of the year for the Israelites. But we still have that same pattern of celebrating these high moments and recognizing God's work in our world. In a blink and you'll miss it section here in chapter 23, you will get the foundations for what later becomes the celebration of the years of Jubilee. We are told about the sabbatical years and how the people of Israel were supposed to take a sabbatical year every seventh year, a year of rest for the fields, a year where everything could grow wild, a year where you did not do all the hard, backbreaking work of planting and tending to crops and harvesting. And the intention there was to remember that God is the one who produces the fruit of the land, that God is our source of fruitfulness, like we talked about on Sunday. It was also a reminder to help those who perhaps did not have an allotment of land or did not have crops so that they could live off of the land with the people. But basically, it was a reminder that God owned everything and that God was in charge, and that we shouldn't look to our own work for our comfort. The unfortunate thing here is that we never see an example of the Israelites actually practicing the sabbatical year or the year of Jubilee. And so it's sad to see that the Israelites didn't really get the message here. And it would be hard for us today to think of a whole year where we just rest and let things grow on their own or just kind of progress on their own. That's just completely foreign to our Protestant work ethic mentality. But the reminder there that we need to hold on to is that God is the God of fruitful growth, like we said on Sunday, and God will produce what we need. God will provide what we need, and we are not the source of our own comfort and provision. Finally, in chapter 24, we get this first real experience of communal worship that takes place in the community of the Israelites. Moses makes the altar, he makes the sacrifices, he sprinkles the blood on the altar and then sprinkles the blood on the people. This, of course, foreshadows the blood of Jesus Christ that brings us our salvation and our freedom. But also then we get this experience of Moses and the leaders going up to meet with God. And we get this amazing little glimpse into what that means, that they witness the feet of God, and underneath the feet of God, we read that there's something like a pavement of sapphire stone, and that they were able to behold God. Even that they ate and drank in this experience, much like we would go to the table for the bread and juice of communion. But then we get this even more special experience of worship in which Moses gets to go up and have a personal experience with God. Much like later on, the high priest will go into the Holy of Holies, and this one high priest will have this yearly encounter with the unfiltered presence of God. But very interestingly, Moses also has to do a little waiting in this act of worship. He has to be still for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, that's when the Lord appears to him. So we get these different elements of worship that continue on into our present day. This idea of gathering together around the altar of God. This idea of making some sort of sacrifice, of eating and drinking, being in the presence of the body and blood through communion. This idea of patiently waiting, meditating, being still in the presence of God, and God showing up and us beholding God in a mystical, powerful way. All of these things can still be accessed by us in our acts of worship today. It would be amazing to have this kind of experience in which we could see the feet of God, or we could have the fire on the mountain. But we still have very powerful experiences of worship, even if they are not this visual and this experiential. But it reminds us just of the central place of worship in our life personally, and our life as the community of God. And as we move into next week's readings, where we learn about the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle's specific makeup, then we will see how important worship is as the central act of the society of the Israelites. I hope that worship will continue to be the central act of the Byron United Methodist Church community. And I hope to see you this Sunday as we worship together. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you soon.